Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Commonwealth Home Support Programme 2022 to 23 extension. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we all meet today and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend the acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the line today. My name is Martin Dempsey. I'm the Director of the CHSP program section within the Home Support Operation branch in the Department of Health. Today, we'll be joined by a couple of members of the department for the panel. Nick Hartland, the First Assistant Secretary of the Home and Residential Division, Russell Herald, the Assistant Secretary of the Home Support Operation Branch, and Nick Morgan, the Assistant Secretary of the Support at Home Reform Branch. I would like to remind the audience today that live captions are available for this webinar. There is a link to the live captions available on the webinar registrations webpage. The webinar will also be recorded and available on the health website under the aged care webinars in the next coming days. I would also like to remind you that you can find out any information about the Commonwealth Home Support Program extension and the future Support at Home program by subscribing to our webinar and our newsletter at the Department of Health's webpage. Today, we'll be discussing several things, and it's been really good to get the response rate up at the moment for the people on the webinar. We've had over 2,000 registrations, so there's a lot of interest. Today, we're going to be discussing a couple of points. The first one, the administration arrangements for the one-year CHSP extension from 1 July 2022 to 30 June 2023. The arrangements for moving to payment in arrears, including monthly reporting, grant agreement negotiation and timeframes, and transition support available for providers. We're going to be talking about the national unit price range, and how these arrangements will help prepare providers for the future Support at Home program in July 2023. We're also going to have time to have a lot of questions and answers for you, and if we don't actually get time to get through them all, there'll also be a frequently asked questions and fact sheet following this. I'd like to also invite all participants of today's webinar to post your questions through the Q&A function in WebEx. These will be answered by the Q&A panel later on today. And also we've received quite a few pre-webinar questions, so thank you very much for submitting them. And we're going to try and cover them in the presentation, and if they're not, we'll also address them in the Q&A afterwards. To be able to actually submit the question, you can do this through the Q&A function on WebEx, which is at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, and select Q&A. Type your question and submit it to the panel, and then we'll try and answer it. We might not be able to get through all of them, but we'll try to do our very best too. The one thing I do recommend is to just don't be too specific about your organisation, that to put it at a level of which we can apply it to multiple organisations. As I said, we're trying to respond to as many as we can throughout it and make sure that we also update through the Q&A following. So to begin with, we're just going to start with Nick Hartland, our First Assistant Secretary for the Home and Residential Division. Nick is going to set the scene as to why we're doing this, what we're doing, and how CHSP and the future reforms fit together. So over to you, Nick.
I think, the first thing to say, and I know many of you will be quite aware of this, how CHSP and the Home Care Packages program work together has been an issue for quite a while. I mean, at least since 2015, there have been discussions and work done on better integrating the two systems. There are elements of the CHSP program that we really think should be retained and are a very important part of aged care. And in fact, one of its stronger elements, that quick access to low-level services is really important. It's a crucial part of aged care, and it's actually one of the things that the NDIS, I think, wishes that it has. And understanding the relationship between price and outputs, which I know is a bit of a journey for us still in CHSP, is really important. But CHSP, we think we're closer to where we need to be than we are with the Home Care Package program. So, this reform isn't about just rolling out a bigger home care package program. If you go to where the Royal Commission got to, you know, it envisaged different funding arrangements across the system, and highlighted a couple of areas where there needed to be greater effort around aids and equipment, for example, respite they also highlighted, and more complex care. They weren't very specific with exactly how to fund the new system. So that in effect is a work that they wanted the department, you know, effectively said to the department that we need to take forward. They did have some structural solutions about independent price setting, which are working, you know, working in the government's response. So where we are at the moment is that the department's working on the design of a new system across all levels of the in-home system, and you know, we will be consulting on that pretty soon. And I don't want to get too far in front of myself, but I think there's a couple of key points we can make about it, which help you to see why we're wanting to reform CHSP program now, because we don't want there to be a big reform shock in July 2023 for CHSP providers that threatens their viability. We think we need to reform, see the current work that we're doing on arrears. But anyway, just to turn to the key kind of the system. Now, the main thing that we do across all levels of the in-home support system is, you know, get the funding that more closely aligns to their needs. And you know, you can see that as a similar process to what happened with ANAC. And so there's a lot of technical work in the background about understanding about what people's needs are, what the resource requirements of that are, and you know, as I said, we're nearly ready to kind of reveal and talk to you about it. One aspect of that is that what consumers, clients, you know, Australians will get out of this, you know, the consumer-facing aspect of it will be a support offer that's more granular. So we're not quite envisaging the full NDIS individual plans, but we think there does need to be, as a result of assessment, more specificity about the services that a person needs, and that gives them and providers better guidance over what should be funded. Now, that kind of happens at the moment, but because of the delays in the system about getting access to home care packages in particular, the outcomes of assessment aren't that useful to providers, because often there's some time for, you know, between assessment and the person actually receiving services. So obviously that bit needs to be fixed, but there is still quite a lot to be fixed in the way plans work. So as I said, now's not the time to sort of talk in a huge amount of detail about how those plans work. Nick might be able to add some more, but the important point is that that has quite a bit of implications for the funding arrangements. So, you know, this is still being worked through, but if you take a view that really important reform for consumers is to get a better understanding about what aged care should be providing for them and what they should expect from their providers, then that has to flow through to the way in which you fund providers. And so we actually have to have a much better understanding about what was delivered for what consumer by providers. And we see moving to arrears as a step towards that, to a system that looks more like a fee-for-service system. That still, you know, we recognise that there's going to have to be a fair bit of discussion about how that works, so we don't impose costs on the system. But the first step, we think, is to move to a payments and arrears arrangement. We would like, as much as possible, to get CHSP and home care providers paid in a similar way, so that providers that straddle the two systems don't have to grapple with two entirely different funding systems. But I think, just to kind of return to where I started, that sort of journey means that home care providers are actually going to have to get used to some of the aspects of CHSP that are in CHSP, you know, with terms of understanding what service lines are funded and how many units are delivered against that service line. So I'll sort of end again on that note, that the long-term reform process isn't about packaging up or moving everything to a home care basis. You know, there are really important aspects of the CHSP system that we want to continue to work on and refine. So on that note, I'll end and throw to Nick to see if you want to add anything to that.
Thanks, Nick. It's Nick Morgan here. I look after the supported home reform branch in the department. So I can probably just put a little bit more meat on the bones that Nick Hartland's just outlined there. And again, as he said, there's still decisions being made and design work underway. So this is sort of preliminary advice, and further work is ongoing. I guess first thing I just wanted to add to what Nick pointed out is that for clients who need only one or two low-level services, which is probably the majority of CHSP clients today, we would see them being assessed and referred straight to individual services, a bit like they are today by the RAS. And it's really for those that need more than that, and that's more the upper end of the sort of CHSP client cohort and those on home care packages. That's where we're sort of developing a classification system so we can look at people and use a new assessment tool that will look at clients' need, look at those people with similar characteristics and sort of group people up a little bit. And then within that, people would get an individualised support plan that aligns to their class. As Nick said, that those support plans would specify individual services that clients are entitled to, rather than for a home care package today, a client will go through a full assessment process and then be told the end result is you're on a level 3 package or something. Not so different for CHSP, where the RAS already do specify service types, but we're likely to have an approach where it's not just the service types, but the service volumes as well. And once we do that, we need to sort of, one of the things we're really working through now, and we'll be coming out and talking to providers about, is if we start to specify service volumes, how do we manage clients' needs changing over time and ensure there's sufficient flexibility to manage that without creating a huge amount of assessment churn. So we've got to work through, that's one of the pieces of work we're doing. Quickly on the funding arrangements, Nick touched on the idea of moving to a more fee-for-service type model. That is the model we're hoping to move to for all providers, in terms of a fee-for-service model alongside a grants program that would be viability grants paid in addition to the fee-for-service. On the fee-for-service side, where we've got a point of delivery payment model that we've had a proof of concept developed. The idea there is it's a bit like if you go to get some allied health yourself, and you're taking your health insurance card and you pay at the point of getting the service, your client contribution, but the health insurance payment's made then as well. We're looking to try and get to a model where government payments could be made effectively at the point of delivery. So, let's say an hour of cleaning's delivered, and at the push of the button, the system checks against the rules that are held by the department. Is this a client? Is this a provider? Is the service consistent with the client support plan? What's the rate for cleaning? Tick, 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 invoice paid. So we want to do, if we do move to this fee-for-service model, we want to try and make the payments efficient and fast. Two key points worth just quickly making on that. The first is that the intention is to have something that's very simple for providers to use, doesn't require changes to existing IT systems. Really what you need is your bank account and your provider number to sign up. And as I say, the payment platform would be checking against rules held by government to release payments. The second point is that the payment platform should be able to collect service data automatically. So you've got point in time service data. That would mean no more DEX reporting. Completely reduce your reporting on what you deliver. It would be captured automatically. Providers would have access to all that data. Consumers would have access to information about what's been delivered for them. And the government would also have access to that real-time data. And that would allow us to analyse in real time where there might be service gaps emerging, where we know people have support plans with particular services, but they're not able to access those services. And that's where something like a viability grants program would be helpful. you know, I think while all services, we'd like all services paid through this platform if we get to that point. So we've got that data and we can see what's being provided. We would also have additional grants to support the viability of providers, and particularly for those operating in thin markets. So that might be in rural and remote areas where client numbers are low, or it might be providers operating with particular diversity groups who have low client numbers. But I'd envisage there are grant guidelines that allow applications for both longer term grants as well as, like we do now with the CHSP, ad hoc grants to support service providers where there are genuine grounds for needing additional support to be viable. Just briefly, you're talking a lot to Rusty and team about the unit prices now for the grants. Obviously, if we move to this model of fee-for-service type payments, that will have to be paid on particular prices. We've got a fair sense of what providers are delivering at today through the data that we collect. I know there's a body of work that's going on now within the CHSP. We've also had Health Consult look at home care package provider costs. They've done a data collection exercise with 80 home care package providers, looking at attributing their actual costs across different service types. So further work to be done there, but we understand, certainly understand well that there's a lot of variability at the moment in unit prices, particularly in the CHSP, given the sort of history of how the program came together, and we'll need to be focused pretty squarely on whatever transitional arrangements might look like as we set those prices in future. I think questions come through on client contributions and means testing. That's something that we haven't really sort of worked through yet. I can't give you too much on that, but obviously home care package program and the CHSP have different approaches to client contributions and means testing, and if we move to a single program, we'll need to do something to bring them together. And we're very conscious that we should be doing something that's fit for purpose. So, I understand around 70% of CHSP clients might only be accessing one or two services, maybe only $1,500 worth of service that they're getting. So we've got to be careful not to over-engineer whatever happens for that group, but might be something simple like pension status that we look at. But there's no decisions taken on that, and a fair bit of work to go looking at it. Look, and then lastly, the last thing I wanted to say is that when we move to a single program is the question of like who would be delivering services under the new program. And if we're bringing home care packages and CHSP, as well as short-term restorative care for that matter, into one program, then we would expect to see providers from both programs able to deliver services for the single program. That may mean for some of you CHSP providers that there are now that you have home care package providers looking to deliver services to clients who aren't there at the moment. But what we're looking to do at the other end of the spectrum is move away from, for people at the home care package end of the spectrum, the requirement to have a single provider who manages a package. As Nick says, we expect clients to have a support plan specifying different services, and we'd hope to be able to give clients choice over whether they want one or multiple providers to deliver those services. And in that scenario, there would also be new opportunities for CHSP providers to deliver services to clients who would currently be home care package clients. So I just wanted to leave that on the table as well. And then lastly, the process, I think I just said lastly, but lastly again, just in terms of the process from here, we do have work continuing that's being finalised that Health Consult's also doing for us around the sort of assessment and classification arrangements that I mentioned. They've done a study of around 2,500 people, assessing 2,500 people to help develop that, and that work's underway now. I mentioned the cost study looking at 80 service providers' costs as well. That's still to be finalised. We've done a bit of consultation through with consumers through an organisation called Where To Research, talking to them about some possibilities for the new program. And we also had, some of you may have participated in a survey that Boston Consulting Group did for us, talking to service providers about some of the potential changes that could be coming and readiness. We'll be organising, actually it might be booked in, I just don't have the date in front of me, but organising a seminar to replay back to providers what we heard from you through that BCG survey in the next few weeks. And then going into next year, we're still hoping to run some trials in the first half of 2022 of the new assessment arrangements. They'll be, at this stage, a kind of living lab type trial where we bring people into a particular environment where we can observe the assessments and get real assessors and do assessments and make refinements to the assessment arrangements through that. And then we're hoping to get out with some broader consultation shortly ahead of, as we go into next year, working more closely with service providers around, particularly where we've got changes that the government's keen to implement, but where those changes need to be still designed and developed, and we'll need to do that in consultation with the sector. So a bit more to come, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks we can provide a much clearer guidance on what that process looks like in terms of timeframes and when you can expect us to come knocking, seeking your input. All right, thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Nick. And also Nick before, so thank you both of you guys. Just reminding, we're just going to do a little bit of a Q&A session now while we're just talking about, a lot of this is beyond July 2023, so we're going to be focusing on that a little bit first, and then we'll go into the CHSP contracting aspect that Russell will be able to speak to. So just reminding you about the Q&A function. On the bottom right hand side of the screen, you'll be able to log some questions down there, and we have had quite a few come through already. So I'm just going to ask a couple. So the very first one, which actually goes, I think it's probably going to Nick or the other Nick, is going to be regarding providing services from 30 June 23 beyond. So beyond the 30th of June 2023, how will organisations register to provide these services? That question is also linked though before a response to that. Will current CHSP providers be required to be registered for a home care package in the future model?
I might jump in on that one. We are doing some work looking at what that registration process looks like. What I'm envisaging is that we have, a proportionate fit for purpose kind of registration process, so that organisations that are delivering more clinical support, higher levels of care for more complex clients are likely to have a registration process that is more detailed than a provider who's delivering a single service, home maintenance or something at the CHSP end. We do want to get to it's a single program and a single process of registration. We'll work through what the Aged Care Act looks like and how providers are set up in the Aged Care Act, but absolutely conscious, having spent a couple of years here in the department being responsible for CHSP, absolutely conscious of trying to get something that is proportionate, fit for purpose arrangements for the different types of providers we have under the program.
I've got another quick question for you as well, Nick. So in-kind support contributions made by some CHSP service providers are substantial. Example, local governments. Would this be factored into the future national reform agenda? If so, please provide some thoughts and insight.
Yeah, look, it's an issue that's come up through the the issue of the use of volunteers as well, and how those volunteers operate. And I think that the process that you'll be talking about after this around how moving to payment in arrears and setting unit prices for the grants has already raised a number of these questions, and how that applies where we know from the CHSP we have pretty reasonable data in CHSP index against individual services at the individual level, and we can see, against the funding that's been provided, what level of services are being delivered and where there are additional services effectively being delivered based on in-kind support being put into the system. So it's something we're certainly really conscious of. It's something that's a bit tricky to factor in. I mean, the way I look at it is we need to be careful not to factor that in to setting prices that are effectively too low for some providers who don't have access to volunteers or who don't have access to the additional, if you like, in-kind support. If for example, the local councils are putting in resources from other places into those services. So I think it's really going to be very important to tease those issues out in price setting, and then the extent to which those services can continue to be provided. I wouldn't want to discourage them, but haven't really quite worked through what the implications would be.
Thanks, Nick. I'm aware that you have to rush off to a budget right now, so thanks for all the work that you just put in. Thank you. I'm going to throw this next question from Kate to Nick Hartland. Nick, sorry, Nick, are you there? Can you hear me, just to make sure?
Yes, I'm still there. I have to go to a meeting in a sec too, but let's take Kate's question.
Okay, sure. Is there any plans to means test CHSP? I know Nick Morgan just mentioned a little bit about it, but it goes into the next bit of the question. We have many examples of clients declining home care packages because it's cheaper to remain on CHSP. Some clients have been offered a level 3 or 4 but decline this and then go back to My Aged Care to get more CHSP referral codes. Some clients on CHSP are receiving the equivalent of a level 3 or 4. They are never going to transition to home care packages. So it goes into the means bit first, and your thoughts on that, moving a client through the system.
Well, look, there's no proposition about changing the fee and means setting arrangements from government yet. So that bit of work, like, we do have to fix that anomaly. I agree. Now how it's fixed and the exact form of that, we don't have something that to hand, but we know we need to look at that issue. But there's no proposal at the moment to alter the means testing and fee setting arrangements. But I think it's an issue that'll have to be discussed over time. Yeah.
And Nick, do you have one chance for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
This is just about, because there's been quite a few of them about sector support development. Will there be a role for sector support with training of service providers workforce into the future, and how will this look in the future support at home?
Well, as you know, we've got a survey out with sector support and development to get a better understanding about what's delivered. I certainly think there's a role for a range of organisations in the transition, but we need to kind of understand a bit more exactly what's happening in that program. And in the very long term, all of the stuff that we do needs to be more oriented to consumers, not providers. So there's a long long-term, sorry, it's a bit of repetitive English, but there's a long-term project to make sure that the whole system is really focused on consumers rather than providers. And so sector support and development, I think what it looks like in the future, it will be different to today as a result of those longer-term trends.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
Okay,
I'm aware you have to go. Okay, thank you, Nick.
Yes, thanks very much. Talk to you soon.
So I know that there's still a flurry of questions that are still coming through at the moment, and as I said at the start, if we aren't able to answer them in the next little bit, we will make sure that we respond to them in the fact sheet and frequently asked questions following this meeting. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to throw to Russell Herald, Assistant Secretary, who's heading up the CHSP extension, to go through more of the nuts and bolts about exactly the Commonwealth Home Support Programme next year and what we have to do in the planning to be able to get there. This covers things to do with obviously the movement to payment in arrears, the increased reporting, as well as the ACIL Allen's unit price range that we're adopting as part of the grants going forward. So over to you, Russell.
So yeah, as Buddy said, I'll run through these reforms. Now I'll go through sort of working through on the basis that people have had a chance to look at the fact sheet that we published. But I'll sort of go into a bit more detail on some of the elements that were outlined in that fact sheet. And I've also been monitoring some of the questions that have been coming through in the Q&A, and I'll try and address some of those as we go through the slide deck as well. But I also know that there is quite a few questions coming through. I think we've got over 120 at the moment. We may not be able to get through all of them today, but we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible with specific answers if we can't get to them today. So moving on to the first slide. So I'll go through this briefly. It builds on the fact sheet, or reflects the fact sheet we sent out on the 29th of October. So the reform proposals that we are looking to implement from 1 July 2023 have three core components to it. So the first is moving to payment in arrears, so monthly payment in arrears, based on 1/12 of the fixed grant value. So I want to be clear because there's been a few questions in the Q&A here. So it is the amount of payments will not be based on actual service delivery at this point in time. It's not fee for service. It is still a grant agreement. It's just that the grant will flow after the fact and based on 1/12 of the grant value. So in terms of the payment, it doesn't relate normally to the price or the outputs that are in the grant. It is if you are funded $120,000, for instance, in a year, you'll get $10,000 per month, and that is fixed. The reason we have done that is in the feedback that we had through the survey and through the working group that we had, we noted that there was and as Nick mentioned earlier, there's a wide variety of prices and business structures across Australia at the moment. Legacy issues from a home and community care program, but also just the way in which organisations operate. So we know that the structure of the CHSP provider market is not uniform, and so moving to a individualised unit price and fee for service is not something which is doable with risk in the near future. But as Nick also mentioned with the supported home program, that sort of outcome is where we are driving certain elements, not all of the elements, but certain elements of the supported home program. And so this is an initial step towards that outcome. We also heard from the provider survey and the working group that there are issues around cash flow in moving to payment in arrears from payment in advance. So we're looking at a bit of a staged move to the payment in arrears mechanism. So at the moment, everyone's on 3-month quarterly in advance. That will change. So you'll get 1 month in advance on July, and then the August payment will be, and thereafter will be month in arrears. So you will receive the payment in early September for the August month. Now, the main thing in all of that is there will not be a requirement to meet service delivery in order for that payment to be made. So it will essentially be an automatic payment with one exemption. And that's the second tier that we have in the reforms, is getting providers to move from 6 monthly reporting in the DEX system to a monthly cycle from July 2022. So providers will have a couple of weeks after the end of the month in order to submit updated data into DEX based on what has happened over the previous month. It doesn't need to be done on a monthly cycle. It can be done more regularly if your organisation has the capability. But we are asking providers to do it on a monthly basis. Now the reasoning for this, it's a preparatory step as well for support at home. It's part of getting organisations to be able to internally better track and be able to provide advice around service delivery on a more regular basis. So whilst payment systems might change and are still being worked through in the support at home program, what we are trying to drive here is the ability for providers to have sort of a more real-time understanding of what is going on in terms of consumer-facing service delivery. And that is actually one of the reasons why sector support and development is not in scope for some of these changes, is because it's not as much of that consumer-facing service delivery. So in terms of what we do with compliance around the monthly reporting, it's not anticipated to be overly aggressive. What we are looking at here is we're looking for providers to do their best and to work through and update that information, within a couple of weeks after the end of the month, so that we can, make sure that providers are moving towards, moving along this reform journey to support at home. We won't immediately move to mechanisms of stopping paying if you don't do the monthly reporting. We will work collectively with providers on the issues that the provider is facing. And so long as we're seeing a journey towards the outcome we're looking for, we'll be quite flexible. If, however, we get to a point where after some warnings that we can't see activities happening, after a little while, we might get to a point of saying, well, hold on, we might pause a payment or withhold a payment because we haven't been able to see that sort of movement along that reform journey. So really that's the major thing driving there. It is, let's spend 22-23 financial year trying to get those reforms moving towards the support at home changes from the 1st of July. The third reform is around the unit pricing and outputs. And I know there's a lot of sensitivity in this space and a lot of concerns. And so I'll talk through a bit of that in this space as well. But one of the issues we have as we move along to the support at home reforms is, as Nick Morgan was mentioning before, the sort of fee for service based on prices, which are more uniform. The CHSP system is completely ununiform at the moment. Two providers in the same location delivering the same services can be funded differently. And so what we're trying to do is get a measure of, or an improved measure of equity across the country. Now, it is sensitive because some providers' business structures or some providers' cost bases are not necessarily aligned to those prices at this point in time. And I'll talk about that moving forward in a couple of slides' time around what we're doing in that space. But what we're trying to do here is trying to get not everyone onto a single price nationally. We're trying to get everyone into a more consistent sort of range, dropping off the bottom end and dropping off the high end, so that it's easier for providers to move to a more consistent singular price in new support at home programs. So this is about, again, that move in the reform journey. I'll also talk about, and the fact sheet mentioned regional remote issues, or remote and very remote issues, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the basis of what we're doing here. The link at the moment for 22-23 financial year is, if you don't deliver on that price now because your structure doesn't meet it, it doesn't automatically mean you don't get the money. It's still a grant, it's still a fixed amount of money. It's the architecture of the the contracts is sort of sending a signal that this is sort of where the price range is headed to. But I also know that COVID factors, other recruitment factors play in certain areas. And again, I'll speak to that shortly. There are three other support types which are not changing in the pricing structure at the moment. So goods, equipment, and assistive technology. That, because it's high price variability, just depending on the particular piece of equipment, that'll be based on based on dollars of each of the assistive tech. So it's just a individual price. Home modifications is the same thing, so there's no fixed price. Assistance with care and housing, there was a webinar for those providers, I think on the 9th last week, that because it's been split into two and the navigation supports are moving over into care finders, we are not changing that system at this point in time, although more work will need to be done around unit pricing for hoarding and scholar activities moving forward as part of the Support at Home program. And again, I'll mention some of that stuff a little bit later in the presentation. So that's an overarching summary of the changes in that space. There was a question, I think, which said, if we deliver lower outputs, would we have reduced money? The answer to that one was no. Conversely, just to be clear, if providers deliver more outputs, additional money doesn't flow. So what we're taking here is a risk-based approach by saying you've got a fixed grant amount, giving providers certainty during this 2022-23 financial year. So we'll move on to the next slide. So these are the unit prices that we've come up with based on the work that Ace and Alan have done on our behalf. And they've discussed, so what that process was, just so everyone can get a sense of it, is they've gone and had a look at what providers have reported in the data. So in the DEX data, we have information which says how many outputs have you delivered, how much money did you spend in your acquittals, and what is your effective unit price on average. So they've had a look at that across the country and had a look at the distribution to come up with what's a reasonable sort of range. The other thing that they've done is they've consulted with Health Consult, which is the team doing the cost build-up work for the new Support at Home program. They've also had a look at NDIS. They've also had a look at other service systems and come up with what these numbers are is a reasonable range for client funding, so for Commonwealth funding, based on a weekday 9 to 5 service delivery model, entry-level aged care. So we know that there are variances when it comes to weekend and overtime, and time and a half, double time, all that sort of stuff in terms of wage costs. And we also know that revenue streams for providers is not just from the Commonwealth. So this is one tense or sensitive issue, and I'll just state it now. And I know that a lot of providers don't necessarily like it, but the prices here are not meant to represent the cost of service delivery. The prices here are what the Commonwealth is willing to put into the grant agreements. We on top of this, we expect providers to raise a reasonable contribution from clients through its fees policies. And so we know that on average, around about 10% of service costs across the country in CHSP are being met by consumers. Now, I know that some providers have specific focus on specific cohorts like homelessness and whatnot, where consumers cannot, they don't have the means to raise fees. But there is an expectation in these numbers that where possible, providers are meant to be looking at charging fees for those who can afford to do so. So I don't want people to assume that this number reflects cost of delivery, because that's not what it is. But what we have done is we've had a look at what providers have been telling us that they've been charging fees on average, and that is reflected in these prices. So, for instance, Meals on Wheels, so it's not Meals on Wheels, Meals pricing reflects that there's a significant chunk coming from consumers in terms of the cost of food and whatnot. So the cost of service delivery may be $18 to $20 per meal, but what the Commonwealth funds is, between that $7.15 and $13. Conversely, we know with allied health and therapy services, it's not a material consumer fee contribution. So it's only built into this a few dollars on top of that price range. There's a question in there about will the ACEL Allen report be published? We're working through that at the moment, and we hope to get that released in the not too distant future. It will outline sort of what that reasonable consumer contribution element, which has been factored into the equation. The last thing that I'll mention is if we have a look at the spread of services, so spread of providers and what they're being funded at the moment, the majority of service providers, and again, I'm going to ignore remote and very remote, which I'll get to shortly, the majority of providers are already funded within this range and won't see material change, or actually any change, to their contracts as a result of these unit price ranges. So there will be a couple of other. So the one thing I will just add in there, just while I remember, providers will have seen from the letter that was sent out, I think last Tuesday, around how this impacts the service offering in order to bring people down into these price ranges for the contracts. We have received some feedback from that already from a few providers. There was one in particular from Western Australia. As a result of that, there has been a slight error picked up in the methodology for a few providers, so a small subset of providers. There was a error in some of the price and outputs balancing. We are correcting that at the moment, and a revised letter will be coming hopefully by the end of the week, if not early next week. So bear with us if some of this stuff isn't making sense in terms of the letter that we sent out, because there was quite a bit of a quirk that was picked up. So the way this will work is for anyone who's funded within this range at the moment and is delivering, nothing really will happen. For those who are delivering below the range at the moment, they'll be brought up within the range and potentially will get additional funding if they've been delivering appropriately at this point in time. For those who are delivering above the range, so are funded above the range at the moment, and again, ignore regional and remote, which I'll get to shortly, we're not taking money away. So that's the key point there. We are not taking money away, but we will be having some additional conversations with you. And so that is moving on to the next slide, which is a case study for those impacted by this. Next slide. This one. So case study. So where actually no, I'll come to that later. We'll actually go back to the previous slide. So I've said this out of order. Again, if we can just park the regional and remote. Actually, no, we're going to talk about that here. So in the fact sheet we sent out last week, we said that there was a limited amount of scope to negotiate the price. Actually, can I just check something? I just saw a comment 4 minutes ago saying Russell mentioned changing slides. Are we meant to be seeing a slideshow? I'm only seeing the title slide. Can I just confirm if people are seeing slides move? Okay, yes. Okay, cool. So I'm not sure what was happening there. Okay. Okay, so the negotiation that we're sort of considering to be in scope is twofold. One is around regional, so remote and very remote areas, which are classified under the modified Monash model as areas 6 and 7. I'm hoping most people are aware of what that means, but basically, outside of regional areas. And we're all correcting historical anomalies. So one of the things that was raised with us during the consultation was that the providers are being funded for services that they're actually not delivering. They're actually delivering other service types, but they haven't had an opportunity to correct those service types. So if you come to us and say, well, we're being funded for other food services as a service type, but we're actually delivering meals, you can come to us and say, let's shift us over to meals, or any other examples like that. So if the base of your contract in terms of what you're delivering is out of whack, historically, come to us and say, this is actually what we're doing, and we can tweak in that space and sort of correct the contract so we can get a better base for the 22-23 financial year. The other thing that we're willing to look at, we don't want a huge flood of it, but what we are willing to look at is, hypothetically, if you're sitting at the bottom of the unit price range, but you're actually delivering at the top of the unit price range historically, and you've been historically delivering at like 90% of your outputs instead of 100% because of that, we're willing to have a look at that through a business case to say, well, look, historically, that's what's been happening. That's the reality. Let's just reset the equation. But we're not looking at a situation where everyone comes to us and says, let's just put us up to the top of the band. We're looking at those sort of exceptional cases where it's very clear based on the data that you've been giving us that the architecture of the current contract is completely out of whack. So that's the historical anomalies that we're looking at. It's a material criteria to make those changes, but we're happy to look into that for you. The reason why we're not looking at doing a material change for everyone and we're having these ranges is we're not, the actual administrative burden of doing that across 1,400 providers and 6,000 service activities or funded activities over the next 8 months is pretty much too much. So we want to knock off the big issues, not the minor issues. So the minor issues we'll deal with through the flexible compliance and the ongoing discussions with funding agreement managers around, what's really happening on the ground. So then we move on to remote and very remote. So the ASIL Allen work, which when we publish it, will basically show that the data that's been reported across Australia is there doesn't seem to be a material difference in the cost structure of providers from M1 to M5, so cities to regional. It was actually quite fascinating. The cost structures in cities in many instances seem to be higher than in sort of outer cities or, regional areas like Wagga Wagga or Gold Coast or whatnot, so the non-capitals. There wasn't a clear theme coming through around those price differentials in the data, which was quite fascinating to us. So what we've done is we've taken an approach where the prices that we've got are sort of a reflection of what we're seeing as an average across M1 and 1 to 5. But we do know that it's not representative, and we did see in the data that M6 and 7, remote, very remote, is a lot higher. So what we are going to do is say, and we will put out a fact sheet and worked examples of this hopefully in the next week, is we'll say to providers, if you're delivering the majority of your services in those areas, you can come up and actually ask us for a loading. You can come and say, take the unit price that we've got for M1 to 5, the one that's been published, and jump it up by either 10, 20, 30 or 40%. So it's a bit of a negotiation there. So if you've got a really, all of your services are out there and it's a really high cost basis, you can go and get a 40% increase in the price range. So it's a unique thing for those who are exposed to those service provisions. What we do expect is for those who are not exposed to that level, you may have services out there in those locations, but 90% of your business is managed in M1 to 5. We are working through sort of like we would expect providers to manage flexibly within their overarching contract. Again, to the extent that that's an issue in terms of meeting outputs, we flexibly manage that within the contracts in the discussions with the funding agreement managers. So we will take that into account in the conversations. So to give a sort of an assessment of sort of what this looks like for, say, a specific provider in a remote area, let's take just as an example, a local Indigenous council in Cape York. At the moment, they will have received a letter from us, which will most likely have seen their price brought down into the range and their outputs increased. What this will mean is that they'll come to us and say, let's bring the price back up and the outputs back down based on 10, 20, 30 or 40%. So that's how that will sort of happen. For people, another example is if you have, if you're funded across multiple aged care planning regions and you are exposed in one aged care planning region only, you'll be able to come and have conversations about that aged care planning region and have a loading built in that area. That will be a conversation, and we will adjust the contracts according to those discussions. At the end of the day, what happens is we would end up reducing outputs to increase the price, and you'll receive a revised single average price across your aged care planning regions, and that may be above the unit price range that we've outlined earlier. So that's sort of the negotiation that we do on that space. There is a comment, I just saw this one just as I'm looking through. Couple of questions. What do you do? There was a question, who do you have the discussion with if the FAM does not have any answers? So the FAM is the first point, and if we cannot resolve, it will be escalated to health, and health will make those determinations based on our processes. So there's an escalation procedure there. There's another question there. Will there be potential to negotiate your service delivery into another ACPR? Again, if it's a historical material anomaly, then the answer is yes. But also we need to recognise that there are flexibility provisions that we have, and we're continuing as a result of COVID, which means we will look at your service delivery in totality and not necessarily in the individual ACPR, so long as there's a reasonable balance and we're not doing massive service withdrawals in certain areas. We can look at making some adjustments in there if there are material structural things that need to be done there. Yeah, so that is that. So if we move on to the next slide, I know there's a bunch of questions coming through as well. We'll come back to those later. I'm just cognizant there's 25 minutes left. So I'll come back and try and get a few more of those towards the end. I really wanted to hone in on a particular sensitivity in this space, which is where we've gone out to you and said, we're going to reduce your price to within the range, we're going to increase your outputs, and you're not eligible for the remote loading process. There's a couple of things here. There's two things that we're going to be asking you to essentially do. And this again comes back to the notion of this reform journey as we move to support at home and the more sort of fee-for-service model, which has got a more consistent price range. The first thing that we're going to ask you to do is consider the scope for further business transformation activities to sort of reduce your cost profile down towards the price range, but also to review your fees policy to see whether or not there's more scope to get contributions from consumers. Now, we're not being directive about that. What we're saying is you may want to consider it as we move to the new world. It may be in your interest to do so as a preparatory mechanism. So that is a strong signal from us that you've actually got a really high price. There might be an issue that you might need to tackle over the next 18 months. But we need to work with you collectively and not aggressively around what that might look like. So again, the reason why we're doing a grant agreement at this point in time is to provide time for these conversations and these issues to be worked through. The other issue that we're very cognizant of is that there are localized circumstances that might be beyond control. And there was one example that came, I think, as part of a recent respite boost proposal where a provider, I think it was down in Tasmania, said that there was absolutely no way that we could deliver at this price because it costs us $200 an hour to get a nurse in this location. Now, some of that might be a factor of COVID, some of that might be other issues, but we know that there are localized factors that aren't necessarily conforming to a nationalized unit price. So what we're trying to do here is find the balance between driving towards that sort of a singular pricing structure and recognizing localized issues. And so we'll consider all of that in the compliance framework. And at the end of the day, if a provider comes to us in the compliance mechanism and says, you're funding us $125 an hour, we can only reasonably get $5 an hour from the consumer or from a client, but I can only recruit at $200 an hour, then that is an obvious element for us to go, oh, okay, we need to take that into account and recognize you can't deliver that many outputs in that location. But where we are interested in taking more focus is one, against the fees policy and whether you are or not, but two, whether or not you've got high administrative overheads, inefficiencies, all that sort of stuff that we can work with you moving forward to sort of have some business transformation. So that is a conversation that we want to open. But at this point in time, if it is a conversation that is a two-way street around the issues, then the compliance is not expected to be aggressive. The compliance is expected to be, okay, we can see that this is the issue. We can see how we're working with you to get to the Support at Home program, and whatever that looks like on 1 July 2023. It's an open, frank conversation. Let's not cause too many problems in terms of cutting out your funding or say punishing you for delivering only 70-80% outputs because of that. So there's that sort of flexibility in that space. So I just wanted to be very clear around all of that. Okay, so I'll move to the and so there was a comment there from Troy around, remember, we're competing with NDIS pricing for workforce, and some services seem to be below NDIS pricing. Again, two things: NDIS prices do not include consumer contributions because it's not means tested. The CHSP has a fees policy. But again, it comes down to if providers cannot get the workforce and the prices are higher because of that, we will take that into account. So, yeah, so I suppose that the hard thing is trying to get that balance. There is a future single price potentially coming, but we know prevailing circumstances are different, and we know means testing, consumer fees policies are different. So just be open and sort of frank with us in the conversations. And if the story behind it all is reasonable, it's rational, then it's one of those ones which makes it easy for us to say, okay, that's fair enough, let's move on. But if you've got high inefficiencies in your business systems at the moment, we are really keen to work with you on ways in which we can address any inefficiencies that are in there and whatnot. So I'll move on. I know I've only got 20 minutes left. So the other things that I wanted to mention are the other service type reforms that are going on at the moment. I briefly mentioned Hatch earlier, which is where we're splitting the funding into two. The navigation services are being subsumed into the new Care Finders program from the 1st of January 2023, and hoarding and squalor will remain with CHSP and move into the Support at Home program. I won't go over that in great detail. For those who weren't on the webinar last week, I would encourage you to go onto the health page and view that webinar. The main thing is that there is continuity of funding in that space. We're not looking at any cuts or reductions in the funding, but we are looking at changes to administrative architecture. The things that I will focus on are sector support and development in specialised support services. So if I'm going to be sort of frank and honest about all of this, is these two service types are a bit of a grab bag at the moment in terms of what services so in terms of what is actually happening out there in the system. It's sort of like the catch-all thing. It was thrown into there to collect all of the hack services that weren't neatly fit. And it's a bit of a challenge for us moving into the new supported home world, moving into the new care finders world, because it's not very clean. And so the process that we're doing at the moment is, and this is where the surveys came into it in the follow-ups that we'll have over the next month or so, is that we're trying to get a better feel of exactly what is going on, particularly in specialised support services, so that we understand the way in which it can feed into the new world. So this isn't necessarily about saying, is it in scope for support and home, and if not, defund it. It is, if it's not in scope for support at home and the new architecture, and we really want to be continuing these specialised services, in what form does that look like? Is it a bolt-on to support at home? Is it in another sort of program architecture? What is the best way to do it? But we really need to be understanding what it is. And so we know that there are some important services being delivered in that space, and we really want to make sure that they continue in the new world to the extent that, you know, they are an ongoing part of the aged care system. There is one caveat to that, which is around, and this is both sector support and specialised support services, which is around navigation services. So obviously, we have Care Finders coming out, which is a new navigation system, and we have another tier, which is the continually evolving My Aged Care system, contact centre, and other navigation supports, which is sort of like your baseline. We think that there's a bunch of navigation services that are being provided, which are sort of like a third tier in the middle, which we don't quite know what it is and what it quite looks like. And we're doing a bit of an assessment around that to see where it fits into the future world. So I don't have any answers around that at the moment, but we're sort of trying to understand what we need to do in that space. So that's a big piece of the work that we're doing going forward. So bear with us over the next sort of 6 weeks as we do that work. And for SSS and SSD providers, we will be following up on the survey results to ask any outstanding questions around some of that, just so that we can get a bit of a sense of what to do there. SSD, the other thing I'll say is, at the moment, you know, there was a big piece of work to update activity work plans, and there was a survey on performance done recently. Where we need to go with sector support and development is fascinating. It is interesting for the 22-23 financial year. What we will be looking for is not only supporting providers to sort of transform to the reforms we're talking about now, which is the payment in arrears and the increased reporting obligations. We're also going to be looking at those providers working strongly around supporting providers prepare for support at home. And there'll be a strong focus around what that looks like, and business transformation support and other bits and pieces like that, so that we can roll out funding in that space to sort of help that reform journey. And so what we will be doing as part of the review of SSD is collectively looking at what providers are doing now, and then going back out to providers and saying, well, actually, this is where we think we need providers, SSD providers, to transition for the next 18 months to support that work. Now, as Nick Hartland mentioned, moving forward beyond 1 July 2023, there is an issue about how sector support plays in the new support at home world. That still needs to be worked through, and we'll continue to have conversations in that space. But again, it is moving towards how do we equate sector support against client outcomes as opposed to provider outcomes. And we need to have some strong conversations around how we best do that. So again, we'll be thinking about that over the next period of time so that we can get the best outcome. So there are a few key points there. Anything that we consider to be in scope for Care Finders program will be only funded for 6 months under SSD and SSS. At this stage, we may look at potential overlaps with Care Finders for 6 months as a transition mechanism to the end of the financial year. Things which are clearly out of scope for SSD moving forward and SSS moving forward, we will have conversations with you in terms of what you may be able to do, as opposed to immediately having a defunding conversation. So that's that conversation about, okay, so we actually don't think this is in scope for the future world. We can't find another fit in another architecture, but can you do something like this instead? We will have those conversations. So we don't necessarily look at these processes of pulling money out of the equation. It's about how we sort of best support the aged care system moving forward. So that's a bit of an overview of those 3 service types. So we'll move to the next slide. So I'm being told to wrap up, so we've only got 15 minutes. I wanted to talk about the last piece of the puzzle, which is transition support for smaller providers in the move to payment in arrears. The first thing that we've done, and it's a slight change to the fact sheet narrative that we sent out last week, as we've been doing a little bit more thinking in this space, effective from next calendar year, all providers will be able to apply to roll over any unspent funds into the 2022-23 financial year up to a maximum of 1 month's worth of funding. So this is to support the cash flow bridging from the effect of moving into payment in arrears. So if you have any leftover funding, we will not get you to acquit it and send it back up to that 1/12. Some people have asked, will we just do a full rollover of unspent funds as we've done in the last couple of years due to COVID? At this point in time, the answer to that is no. We will continue to review that circumstance as COVID plays out over the next 6 months as the restrictions are easing, and we will make further calls on that towards the end of the financial year. But at this stage, we will allow all providers to roll over up to 1/12 as a capital bridging mechanism to the extent that they have that cash reserve there. Second opportunity that will be available, and again, we've made some revisions to this in recent days. If providers have low cash reserves or no cash reserves, they will be able to come to us and bid for cash flow bridging support. At this point in time, the in-scope criteria are you are funded less than $625,000 per annum from CHSP. You have basically no cash reserves. You are basically a sole CHSP provider, or you don't really have other revenue streams like home care packages or NDIS. You must be meeting most of your outputs to date, so you've got good compliance, and you need to be able to submit by the end of March, that application. Now, there is an interaction between the two that we need to take into account, which is we obviously don't know whether or not providers will have an underspend at the end of the financial year by March. So that application will be based on projections and performance to date. If you end up having an underspend but you didn't project one, we will claw back the capital support through the cash flow grant to the extent we might need to. So there is a bit of an interaction there. Again, we will put out a fact sheet in the next week or so with worked examples of this to show what it means. But at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is to support the smaller providers to manage the cash flow impact. Now, on our analysis, roughly half of all CHSP providers are nominally in scope for that cash flow bridging support. I think it's around about 800 providers. Yeah, it's the bigger providers who have the bigger balance sheets that we are not looking at providing support to. Now, I will say that whilst that is going to be the criteria for the grants, if there is material service delivery risk that cannot be managed through other financing mechanisms and you're a larger organisation, I am willing to have sort of conversations as we go into your circumstances to see whether or not there are other things that we may be willing to do or other ways of managing the process. But our expectation at this point in time is that the larger organisations will work through financing mechanisms, work through their organisational structures to manage the cash flow impacts. We have helped by having that sort of 1 month in advance in July, but we do know that there are obviously fiduciary responsibilities on boards that they need to manage, and I do want to hear where there are material problems that might emerge in this transition. But again, I'll reiterate that this is part of a reform journey, and so we are looking for providers to at least start this journey now. Is that the last slide? Or have we got another one? Go to the next slide. Implementation timeframes. I'll skip over this. It's similar to what's in the fact sheet, so if everyone wants to look at that, go there. The last thing I will plug before we go into 10 minutes of questions is, as you're hopefully all well aware now, there is now a national footprint of mandatory home care, also mandatory vaccination requirements and reporting requirements for in-home care workers across home care and CHSP. Tasmania being the last jurisdiction to make that change, I think, over the last few days. You will all be aware that hopefully that compliance calls are now being made by the Community Grants Hub to say, where are you going in all of this? How are you up to? Getting all of your output data up to date on a weekly basis, due every Tuesday, and getting workforce up to 100% double dose by the end of the calendar year. At this point in time, they are compliance calls to support you going through the mix. This is, I'm using this opportunity just as a forewarning that those compliance activities will start to increase in status over the next 4 weeks. Those providers who are not seeing material improvement will start getting letters from the department. And if we don't get material compliance by middle of December, the conversations may potentially start about changing payments structures or other elements in that space. So I would encourage providers to go back and closely look at the compliance regime, not the compliance against the public health orders and the reporting obligations to My Aged Care, and get that information up to date and get the workforce as close to 100% as possible as soon as possible, so that we do not need to move to those next steps. So I just wanted to plug that at this point in time. Next slide. Okay, so these are just links. So we'll go to questions now. So I'll hand back over to Marty to go through the questions for 10 minutes.
Thanks, Russell. Look, we'll just fire out a couple, and just to reiterate a couple of things. First one is that there are going to be some fact sheets published in the next couple of days about the MMM loading and also the transition support fact sheet. There's been lots of questions that Russell's actually answered as they've come through. So I'd just like to say we have had approximately 300 questions come through. There's a lot of themes that are very similar. A lot of the themes, and I'll answer this next a little bit just to give Russell a bit of a break, about DEX reporting. So a couple of the questions that have been about DEX have been, what happens if a business does fortnightly updating and they're going to be actually late to be able to do the 10 business days post it? Is there going to be a penalty? Are we going to be paid? There is a bit of a lag in between when the reporting will be and when the actual next payment goes out. At this point in time, we're looking at trying to build up the capacity of organisations and actually doing monthly reporting. If they do not get all of the data in by that particular date and they have to go back in the following months post it, they are able to do that. DEX allows them to be able to do that. We're not changing the functionality of it. We're getting providers more used to monthly reporting. In terms of will it be open beyond this period, sort of just answer that question, but yes, it will be, in terms of you can submit any time actually within that first 6 months, the same sort of thing that happens at the moment with DEX. It just might be a little bit later for that month. It's not going to impact the amount of money that you're going to be getting. It's still going to be the 1/12 amount. There's also been a couple of questions about, is there any changes in the actual IT structure or expected for the software? It's exactly the same, it's just increasing the frequency. That's all we're doing with the DEX reporting. It's not changing any of the actual other mechanisms that have to happen within it. It will just be a more frequently reporting. One of the questions I'll just quickly go to you, Russell, is our current IT systems will not be sufficient to meet the increasing reporting demands and the changes for new support at home program. Will there be any funding available to help our organisation upgrade our IT infrastructure? And if so, when will that become available?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So this is a bit of a challenge one for providers, and I know this. I mean, we know that the CHSP provider base is in varying forms of organisational capability when it comes to the future reform world. Business transformation is a key focus or key issue for me. And I'd like and I want to have lots of conversations with providers around what business transformation might be required or needed to support the sector transition. Now, separately, the Boston Consulting Survey that was done for Support at Home also gave us a lot of information about provider readiness and capability. And part of the work that will be done collectively between my area, which deals with CHSP, and Nick Morgan's area, which deals with the new reforms, it is coming up with that transition approach and working with providers on how they do that. So I'm very keen to get out to providers sooner rather than later about what support we can provide in that space. The encouragement that I would provide at this point in time is for organisational, those involved in organisational governance, boards and whatnot, to really start thinking about the best way they would transform their business to this consumer-directed care, reporting on individualised basis, tracking costs on individualised basis, all that sort of stuff. As a way of thinking about what is needed, so that when you engage in government about the cost structures that are costs involved, the impacts involved, we can have frank conversations about what is needed, and we can really come to the table around how we can support you in that space. So I'm really quite interested to hear about that sort of space moving forward. But we are looking in the background about what sort of support we can provide.
Thanks, Russell. I've got, I think we can get 2 or 3 more ones in. We'll just keep this really short. If our organisation underdelivers on outputs in any given month, will there still be paid a full 1/12 of our annual budget for that month?
Yes. So the only reason why we will have compliance is if there is a material reduction over the period. So if after 6 months or 12 months you're delivering at 20% of your outputs, that's when we start getting worried. If you have fluctuations, we're not worried.
Question from Maria. Reducing outputs will mean a potential reduction of services for a community, especially regional ones. How does the department plan to address this?
So reducing outputs, so I think this is part of the error I mentioned earlier. Reducing outputs is not something which we are doing, as I understand it, unless at the moment you're delivering less than your agreed outputs. So it's a circumstance where you're bringing prices up to the minimum range and outputs down because you've only been delivering 60 or 70% at the moment because it's been a low funding price. So we are not looking at a circumstance where, well, I don't believe we are looking at a circumstance where we're going to be asking you to deliver less than what you're currently delivering. As I mentioned before, there has been an error which has been picked up in the offer that was provided out last Tuesday. But in the circumstance where you believe we've given you an offer where that is the case, I would encourage you to raise that issue with the FAM as part of the negotiations and escalate that up to health, because we'll have a look at that particular circumstance and address that with you. But the clear thing from us is we are not asking, or we're not expecting to ask you to reduce your services in that space.
Last question, then we'll have to wrap this up. This is from Anita. If clients are if clients are fee exempt at present, will that change? e.g. homeless client or Indigenous clients?
No. So we are asking providers as part of adjusting the prices to review their fees policy to see whether or not there is more capacity, but we're not expecting certain cohorts like homelessness and remote Indigenous, to the extent that there's no capacity, to be charged fees. So if they're exempt at the moment, we're not actually saying you must charge fees. So this comes down to, if the price structure in the contract doesn't quite work because your client base are exempt, then if you're under delivering on outputs by 5-10%, that's okay, we can accept that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rusty. Look, I do apologise we haven't been able to get to all the questions today, but we are going to be doing a frequently asked questions and be posting those ones, because there has been some really good questions come through. A lot of the theming's been around DEX reporting, output changes, as well as accessing for services and the MMM loading. So just to make sure, this is being recorded. It's also, there is captioning that's available as well, and you'll be able to access that. I strongly encourage everyone to subscribe to our newsletter at the Department of Health website. Sign up to the Engage with us through the Engage Hub at the agecareengagement.health.gov.au. Also, for the latest news for CHS, please make sure that you keep in contact with the health.gov.au website as well. Again, if you have any questions, please, you can send them through after the session to the CHSP extension at health.gov email address. And the recording should be available in the coming days, so you'll be able to access this. I'm aware there's a lot of content that has been provided. The first half was about the future reform beyond 2023, but how that is impacting us right now. And thank you, Russell, as well, for all of the work that you've just done for the last 40 minutes about the CHSP extension, payment and arrears, and also the fees pricing. So thank you. I hope you found this very informative today. And again, you can put those questions through to us. Thank you very much, everyone.